Good afternoon and welcome to our today's panel about Ukraine and its democratic perspectives in hopefully democratic Europe. My name is Natalia Churikova and I'm a journalist with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And it's an honor and a great pleasure for me to introduce our panel today. And I will be introducing them in the order of their remarks. First is Oleksandra Dvoretskaya from Crimean, from Ukraine, and she's a chair of Crimean Human Rights Center Action, with experience of work in different parts of the former Soviet Union, so she can make comparisons about those things too. And she's actively working on the human rights issues now in Ukraine. Mr. Karel Schwarzenberg, the former Deputy Prime Minister of the Czech Republic and the chairman of the party Top 09, and a former foreign minister. And I would add that in Ukraine he's a legendary figure among many people, who is a living proof to the fact that the value-based approach to foreign policy is still possible in Europe. Grigory Yavlinsky is the Russian economist and a politician, a professor of economics at the State University and the High School of Economics, and a co-founder and a former chairman of the Russian Democratic Party, Yabloko. And Daniel Baer is our last but one speaker. Sorry for the change in the order. He is the US representative to the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and before that he was a deputy assistant secretary at the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. Welcome. Last year, when we were talking about Ukraine's perspectives in Europe at this forum, almost about this time, this was just before the Vilnius European Union and the Eastern Partnership Summit, and we all guessed that Ukraine will sign the association agreement, and this is how it will get on the path of reforms. We were all wrong because we made our predictions on the rational expectations that the European Union and Ukraine will have a lot to gain from this agreement, and Russia has nothing to lose from it. But Russia interpreted it as encroachment in its own zone of interest and made every effort for Ukraine not to sign the agreement. As you well remember, Ukrainians did what they normally do in these situations. They took it to the streets, they protested. What they saw, the betrayal of the national interests, when the kleptocratic government, which they expected to slowly reform through the implementation of the association agreement with the European Union, has stolen their hope for a more democratic country, for a country governed by the rule of law and with a social market economy. After 3 months of protests, when the president packed and left the country, it was at this particular time when the Russian military in the camouflage entered Crimea and annexed the peninsula. Soon Russia started stirring trouble in the east and south of Ukraine. Since then, Ukraine had a presidential election, and 2 weeks' time it will have the parliamentary election. Will it come out of it as a more consolidated democratic state? Will the war in the east continue? Can Ukraine restore its territorial integrity? And what kind of future will Ukraine have in Europe? These are the questions that I would like to discuss on this panel. And since the annexation and invasion of Crimea started on the humanitarian grounds, I would like to ask Mrs. Dvoretskaya to talk about the humanitarian and human rights situation in Crimea. Thank you.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon.
Извините, буду говорить на русском языке. И извиняюсь, мой английский, наверное, не сможет ГУИМ донести до вас информацию довольно правильно.
I'm sorry, I will have to speak Russian because I'm afraid I won't be able to present the information I want to present in English.
Разделять события, то, что происходило в последние 23 года в нашей стране, то, что происходило во время Евромайдана и события в Крыму, наверное, не стоит, поскольку это не случайное событие, оккупация Крыма. Думаю, что она готовилась не одну неделю и, может, даже не один год.
Well, I think as for the occupation of Crimea, it was not prepared within a week and not even within a year. And probably we should remember the 23 years preceding the occupation and the Euromaidan as well.
Мы остановимся на том, что сейчас есть на виду. Это начиная с марта 2014 года, о том, о чем сказали коллеги. Это с момента, когда вошли российские военные на территорию Автономной Республики Крым и начали оккупацию.
But I would like to start from the March 2014, namely the time when the Russian troops entered the territory of the autonomous Crimean Republic and started the occupation.
К сожалению, март был последним месяцем, когда я имела возможность жить в Крыму. Я сама крымчанка и родилась там, но больше находиться на территории Крыма я не могу, поскольку это небезопасно для моей жизни и для жизни моих родственников.
Despite the fact that I was born in Crimea and I lived there all my life, starting from the March 2014, I was not able to stay in Crimea because it was not safe for me and for my relatives.
С самого начала оккупации в Крыму было похищено 38 человек в марте 2014 года. В основном это были активисты, журналисты, как крымские, так и те, которые приезжали после Майдана в Крым поддержать акции за единую Украину.
Starting from March 2014, 38 people were kidnapped. Those were mostly journalists and activists, as those who were from Crimea region, as well as those who came from Euromaidan to support the movement.
34 из них были освобождены, и все подвергались пыткам. Судьба еще 4 человек с марта месяца на сегодняшний день неизвестна.
34 of them have been freed by now. All of them were tortured, and the fate of the remaining 4 people is still unknown.
С самого начала марта в Крыму не работал ни один украинский канал телевизионный, и было совершено более 70 актов нападения физического насилия в отношении журналистов.
Starting from March 2014, no Ukrainian TV channel was broadcast on the territory of Crimea, and there were numerous attacks on the journalists.
За день до референдума, так называемого, было обнаружено тело крымско-татарского активиста Ришата Аметова со следами пыток.
One day before the so-called referendum, the body of Rishat Aletov, if I'm not mistaken, the activist, was found, and it was known that he was tortured.
Как Россия аннексировала Крым в марте?
How the annexation took place in March.
Те активисты, которые не выехали с территории Крыма и остались, продолжая бороться и отрицая признание вхождения Крыма в состав Российской Федерации, пострадали.
Those activists who refused to leave Crimea region and stayed there and kept fighting, they suffered.
На сегодня мы имеем 4 человек, которые находятся в СИЗО Лефортово. Это Олег Сенцов, Геннадий Афанасьев, Александр Кольченко и Алексей Черней, которые обвиняются в подготовке террористических актов на территории Крыма. Все они были моими друзьями, я их знаю, и, наверное, единственная их преступлением было то, что они не считают Крым российской территорией.
The 4 people are still kept in jail. These are Sentsov, Afanasyev, Cherny, and one more person. All of them were my friends, and the only thing they can be blamed for is that they do not support the annexation of Crimea.
Учитывая российское правосудие, я не уверена, что итог будет таким, что их признают террористами и они получат свои 20 лет лишения свободы.
Considering the situation with the justice in Russia, I do not deny the possibility that they could be claimed terrorists and they will be imprisoned for 20 years.
С момента оккупации пропало около 20 человек. За последний месяц это 7 случаев насильственных исчезновений, которые показывают практику Чечни на территории Крыма, что люди исчезают и их местонахождение никто больше не узнает.
Since March 2014, 20 people have disappeared, only 7 of them during the last month, and no one knows where they are.
Сейчас с 14 октября до 25 будет происходить перепись населения в Автономной Республике Крым, где российские службы хотят собрать максимальное количество информации о жителях, поскольку присутствующие там вопросы много акцентируют внимание на то, в какой вы стране живете и в какой вы стране жили в октябре 2013 года.
Starting from the 14th till the 25th of October, Russia will try to collect as much data as possible on the attitude of people, accentuating the question where the people live in what country they consider themselves living.
Еще одна проблема, которую можно отметить, кроме того, что государство влазит сильно в персональную данные в личную жизнь, это также автоматическое присвоение гражданства. Все те, кто не согласились и не общались с органами государственной власти, считаются отныне теперь гражданами Российской Федерации даже без своего желания. Те, кто имеет украинские паспорта и украинское гражданство, таким являюсь и я также.
Another case of intruding the personal information of people is this automatic citizenship which people receive, those who used to have Ukrainian passports, and I'm one of them.
И в этих условиях на вас распространяется действие российского законодательства, даже если вы сами того не желаете, в частности, выплаты налогов. И для российского правосудия ничтожно наличие у вас второго гражданства, если они вас считают своим гражданином. И это и проблема, с которой сталкиваются те, кто оказывается на территории Российской Федерации, такие как, например, сын Мустафы Джемилева, которого перевели сейчас на территорию Российской Федерации отбывать наказание.
So we all conform to the Russian justice. This also relates to the matters of taxation of people. Russia does not care whether people have another citizenship, since it considers all people its own citizens.
И в отношении крымских татар ведется политика такой тихой депортации. Если мы в 1944 году имели практику, когда людей просто вывозили с территории Крыма, то сейчас против крымских татар направлена основная волна репрессий. Это и обыски, это и запрет на въезд и Рифату Чубарову, и Мустафе Джемилеву, и еще ряду членов Меджлиса и также изданий. Это обыски в крымско-татарских изданиях и обвинения их в экстремизме.
As for the Crimean Tatar people, we now face silent deportation and repressions.
И, наверное, важно сказать, что, завершая свою часть, что в Украине не было фашизма, не было экстремизма, терроризма до того, как туда не вошли российские войска. Ни в Крыму, ни на востоке Украины.
And to sum up my speech, I would like to emphasize that there was no fascism, no extremism in Ukraine before the Russian troops came there.
Thank you, Oleksandra. Mr. Schwarzenberg, we've just heard the story of kidnappings of the foreign citizens, taking them to the Russian prison. When I talked about this with a Czech dissident she said that there was, all of that has happened before, that there were precedents when the Czech citizens were kidnapped and taken to the Soviet Union, and this all sounds very familiar.
Well, yes, it is just like, first of all, I was never dissident, because in the time I was living abroad, I was helping them, but myself I never was. But of course there was a different situation. To put it bluntly, already in the 80s, it was more clearer and clearer that Soviet Union is in full decay. And therefore, even the regime here was more careful. We had no killings anymore, only jail.
She was referring to 1968,
yes,
of course.
And it had a happy end. The situation in Ukraine is much more difficult than ours was, because, first of all, the Soviet Union recognized always that there are Czechoslovaks. But Mr. Putin doesn't recognize the Ukraine nation. There's one basic problem. So, of course, with somebody whom I don't recognize, I can't make a compromise, because I have the first conviction that he belongs to me. That's the first difficulty. Second, let's admit, where Soviet Union was in the 80s in decay, and now Putin put Russia more or less in order. They were rather flourishing. The army is rearmed, first-class uniforms, makes a very good impression. I remember the ragged Soviet soldiers who were garrisoned here after 1968. The present Russian soldiers offer a very different view. So here's an army he can rely on, which is efficient. And as I told you, he doesn't recognize Ukraine. And he invented a very good new technique, this very low-level war, which doesn't provoke a strong reaction, but of course destabilizes fully Ukraine and offers him a chance to get Ukraine as you eat a salami, one little piece after the other, and after a few years it will be eaten or disrupted so that Ukraine will succumb. Because Ukraine is an awfully difficult situation. On one side you have this military conflict, I call it war, the war in eastern Ukraine. On the other side, Ukraine got a terrible heritage from the former governments. The economy is in disarray. The army, as we have seen, in a terrible state, and not really reliable, with officers still from the old times. And of course, what Ukraine would need as urgent as anything to make economic reforms, to put the army in order, make it an efficient armed force, and to reform the administration, which is still too much as in the Soviet time. I mean, there's really great jobs to be done, even for a nation which is in full peace, but in a nation which is warfare, it's more complicated than everything else. So, in my view, it can be only accomplished if Western Europe and United States really fully support Ukraine. The present half-hearted support is really not worth mentioning, because of course Ukraine is a great country and the problems are bigger than in smaller countries like was our country or Hungary or whatever. after '89. And we were not in such a disarray. So, of course, Ukraine would need massive help, massive investments in its industry, which was still the good old Soviet industry. Practically, most of the products could be exported only in the Russian Federation and maybe different other states of the former Soviet Union. To get really a proper income, the Ukrainians would need new products, modern products, efficient production, and so all the benefits of a market economy, which we had now for 20 years. They're not. Our industry modernized. They are not. And if I add to it, there's a necessity to rearm the army, reorganize the army and the administration. I think it's a gigantic effort which the Ukrainians have to do. And adding to that, it can really, I'm sure, only do it with Western help. By their own things, because the lack of means in the midst of war, they can't achieve it. That's a sad situation. Otherwise, when you have been in the Maidan in Kiev or spoke with people in the Ukraine, I would be glad if Czechs, Austrians, or even Germans would be so enthusiastic, pro-European as the Ukrainians are. There is not this Euroscepticism which is in our countries. And therefore I must say, very much admire those people, mostly young people, who are so engaged in present Ukraine. You have to see it, you have to speak with them to get the proper impression. But I don't think any of our countries in Central Europe had after '89 as difficult a job as is now the Ukraine leadership. I'm really sorry for them, but it's manageable, but only with really substantial help from the West. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schwarzenberg. And with the question about what is going to happen in the east of Ukraine, where Ukraine has a war and a conflict which is now currently at the state of ceasefire, but the ceasefire which costs Ukraine 10 lives a day. And the OSCE is charged with the monitoring of this ceasefire. The border of 300 kilometers with very few people and unarmed people. How is it going to deal with this task, and what kind of the end of this conflict do you see, and the role of the OSCE in it? Mr. Baer.
Let me, first of all, thank you very much, and thanks very much to Forum 2000 for including me. It's a real honor to be here, and the Czech Republic's brand of being values-driven foreign policy makes this a especially appropriate place to have this kind of discussion, and obviously Minister Schwarzenberg's own personal legacy in that regard is particularly prominent. You know, the broader, I'll get to your question about where we go in terms of the ceasefire as such, but I want to make 4 points about the broader question about does Ukraine have a European future? And the first is that I think the framing for this panel is exactly right in asking that question. There has been a tendency in the American press, and sometimes even in American government statements, as well as a number of other public statements, to be rather self-centered in the sense of making this about Russia and the United States in some way. And I think it's much more about Europe. When you go to Kyiv and you see the foreign ministry that has a giant 10-story high Ukrainian flag on one side and the flag of the European Union on the other side, it's incredibly powerful. And it's about Europe. The second point is it's about Europe, and one of the other ways that it's misunderstood, including, I think, by a number of officials of the Russian Federation, is it's not about an alliance in a formal sense. It is fundamentally, the changes that are going on in Ukraine, the changes that were demanded by the Maidan are about Europe and what Europe represents in terms of good government that respects human rights, that is accountable, that doesn't have corruption, that has zero tolerance for corruption. It is about European institutions and a European way of life. The third point is that while President Putin has been very successful in distracting a large piece of the attention and focusing it on the military conflict in the East, it has to remain clear in our focus that reform, the development of European institutions, Ukraine's European choice is Ukraine's long-term strategy. It is what will deliver security for Ukraine in the long run. And so that needs to remain clearly in focus. And the fourth point, which I'll do in two parts and get to your question, is, obviously that saying that that's the long-term strategy doesn't make it easily doable. And as Minister Schwarzenberg had said, arguably the challenge in front of Ukraine's current leaders is harder than many other transitions we've seen. But I don't think it's impossible. And I think, it's hard domestically because Ukraine has long had since independence, has never successfully broken free of rampant corruption, has never had a truly accountable, democratically elected government, has never had the institutions of the judiciary, and it still has the old Soviet prosecutor's office, etc. So there's a lot of institution building, a lot of rule of law building that has to take place. I was in Ukraine last week again, and I went to St. Michael's in Kyiv, and in the courtyard there's a new photo exhibition of the Maidan, a number of pictures from the Maidan, each with a quote underneath of somebody who was there and participated and what it meant to them. And I think it was a really important, I found myself being jolted back and remembering what actually people were demanding. We're so focused on the conflict, but the positive affirmative agenda of reform and respect for human rights is still very present, and that is still what civil society is rightly focused on in Kyiv and around the country, where they're not dealing with the active aggression. So I think we need to be very mindful of that and indeed push economic reform as soon as possible. The elections 13 days from now are another opportunity after the May 25th presidential election. There will then be a mostly new Rada to work with the new government, and the test for them will be whether they can deliver on the broad reform agenda that is needed. The other reason, which is not to understate the difficulty of that, the other reason that it's hard, of course, is that President Putin has decided to make it harder than it needs to be. And we can dissect all of the reasons for the tragedy and the fact that it is a tragedy and that it's a chosen conflict. It's not necessary. And to understand why it's happening, I think we have to actually look much more closely at the backsliding on human rights that has characterized Russian recent history. The repression inside Russia is directly connected to the aggression outside of Russia's borders. And nothing that President Putin does externally will fix any of the serious problems that Russia has at home. But one of the things he has successfully done is consolidated Ukrainian public opinion in support of the European choice that has been made. And so public polling shows that Ukrainians are more united than ever from all parts of the country. The presidential election was, despite taking place under difficult circumstances, was a triumph for the Ukrainian people. For the first time, the candidate who came first in the east was the same as the candidate who came first in the west, was the same as the candidate who came first in the south and came first in Kyiv. It's never happened before, and it was a freer and fairer election than they've ever had. So, there are these opportunities that have come from pulling together under hardship. I think what's important now for the international community to do, the question is what can we do? One, we can support Ukraine in terms of pushing them as good friends will to make the hard choices, to make the hard reforms, to put the down payment on their future, and supporting them as they do that. We can raise the costs on Russia for its destructive actions. And we can also not give up on a rule-based global order. We shouldn't let the current contest, the current conflict challenge our underlying commitment to a rule-based global order, no matter how much violence President Putin does to that. And I think in the context of those three things, what's particularly important in the near term is for us to continue to insist. The Russian Federation signed a protocol at Minsk on September 5th, a subsequent agreement on September 19th. They signed up to that. That needs to be implemented. That laid out the ingredients for a sustainable ceasefire. It is not a pick and choose menu. So far, the Russian Federation has been unwilling to follow through on their commitment to support securing the international border between Russia and Ukraine. That is unsatisfactory. There can be no discussion about even contemplating lifting sanctions until Russia makes good on its very recent commitments laid out at Minsk. And so I think where we go from here is Minsk is the game plan that has been agreed for a ceasefire, and that will allow the political space, if the border is secured, if the ceasefire is observed, if the exclusion zones are observed, it will allow the political space for the kind of political engagement that Russia has claimed it wants, and that the Ukrainian government is prepared to undertake when the conditions allow. So the OSCE will continue, the monitoring mission on the ground will continue to be, it's a civilian unarmed force. It will continue to be present and able to monitor and witness and build confidence in the implementation. But the implementation takes Russia getting its forces out of Ukraine, getting its weapons out of Ukraine, supporting the securing of the border, and telling those under its control that they must observe the ceasefire.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. Yavlinsky, I would like to pick from the discussion we've already had so far about the role of the United States and the role of the European Union. And there is, very often we see this blame game in the press, in the opinion pieces in the world press about it was the fault of the United States that it tried to pull Ukraine into NATO. It was the fault of the European Union trying to pull Ukraine into the European Union. And it wouldn't have happened if they just allowed the Kremlin to have its zones of interest.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm very privileged to be in this panel and to speak about such a sensitive and so important issue like Ukraine and what's going on around Ukraine and between Russia and Ukraine. Some preliminary remarks is very important for me. First of all, I want to say that me personally and my political party, we are categorically against the policies which are implemented in Ukraine by Russia. We are against the annexation of Crimea. We are against everything what's going on just now in southeast part of Ukraine. It's absolutely unacceptable. Generally speaking, we can't accept the doctrine of the limited sovereignty, which is Kremlin is trying to realize towards the Ukraine, and it's very clear, especially in Prague. In the same time, and this is point number 2, in the same time, I strongly support the negotiations in Minsk between President Putin and President Poroshenko and signing the agreement on the ceasefire. I think that the ceasefire is extremely important because it's a very bloody conflict, and every step which is made to stop the bloodshed and to stop the war there is something which we strongly support. Especially because we are against everything which can bring Russia and Ukraine to the war. in a practical sense, I want to share with you my idea about the international conference on Ukraine. I think that if to continue the ceasefire policies in line, it is not enough simply the talks between President Putin and President Poroshenko. It is necessary to think about and to call for the international conference where all the sides which are interested must be around the table. It is necessary not to discuss the issues just in the panels and the conferences, but eye to eye, and to express all the views about what is the reason of that conflict, just directly and openly. It would be very, very helpful for the policies. But from the strategic point of view, from the long run, I will say that the peace between Russia and Ukraine would come only when Russia and Ukraine would move to Europe, both countries. This is the only possibility to really find the solution for the situation which is there. It is not possible just when Russia wants to create a corporate state and Ukraine wants to create European kind of state, them to live together. This is not possible simply because really historically relations between Russia and Ukraine are special. This is not a big surprise. And geographically also these two countries have closest neighbors. So this is the key issue. But it is necessary to understand that the attempt in Russia to create a corporate state, this is not just simply accidental event. This is a policy. This is a kind of a new course, which is since 2012 is practically realized in Russia. Anti-European course in Russia as a practical political course is extremely dangerous thing for Russia. I like Russia. This is my country. So I'm speaking this not only from the point of view of Ukraine and Europe. I'm speaking first of all on the national interest of my country. Secondly, second part of my presentation is, of course, I'm not going to give any kind of lessons to Ukraine. I'm simply want to say that there is a lot of things which Ukraine, I think, should do in reforms. But being supportive on the trend of moving Ukraine to Europe, I want to say that Ukraine should implement a big package of economic reforms. First of all, macroeconomic stabilization, banking sector stabilization, fighting corruption, which is really terrible, transparency, and implement the policies which would create the trust, confidence from the side of the population to the government, especially to the new government, the reforms of the energy sector and so on. It's a big story, what's necessary to be done. But there are two main things which is not very often discussed. First, the absolutely ultimate goal for Ukraine is to overcome oligarchic structure of the economy. Otherwise, let's say Marshall Plan, which I'm ready to advocate, is not possible because all money would be immediately somewhere in Cyprus, or maybe even just in a much longer way to go. Immediately. So it's not possible. It's necessary, but it's not possible to do at the moment. So the oligarchic structure of the economy, meaning that the property and the state is just matched together like this, is not acceptable. It is not possible. So this is the first thing. And the second thing is that it must be a public debate in Ukraine on toxic nationalism. Nationalism in Russia is very strong. Nationalism in Europe is very strong. So there is no surprise that it's very strong in Ukraine. And after the military actions, it would be even much stronger than before. Much stronger. That was a right expression, that maybe it was not so strong at the beginning, But now, after the war, after what's happened, it would be really a big problem. It's better to start now, just to do something with this. And the last but not least, I understand that it's not a very popular issue, but the issue of Russian language is a serious issue for Ukraine. This is not a joke. Before, it was one situation with the Russian language, before the changes in Ukraine, before the Yanukovych disappeared. But after the so-called Maidan victory, the question of Russian language have a different substance if Ukraine really want to move to Europe. It's a very important issue. I'm not giving the advice, I'm not giving the recipe, but I'm saying that this is something which must be discussed, not simply declared, but discussed. It's much more serious. And the third part of my presentation would be, from my point of view, the most important. The question is, and what Europe wants from Ukraine? What Russia wants, I explained already. It wants to create a corporate state, anti-European. Ukraine wants to go to Europe. It's also more or less clear. But what Europe wants? What Europe wants strategically? So I want to say that from my point of view, since 1991, since the end of Berlin Wall, after the success of the strategy which was created in Europe after the Second World War, the substance of which was reunification of Europe and created the European Union. Europe had no strategy, especially Eastern strategy. And that is one of the very serious problems. So you remember the very famous article, The End of History. I don't know what about the end of history, but that what happens after the 1990, 1991, from my point of view, the end of strategy. This is true, and this is a big problem. And by the way, I want to remind you, and it's important for me, as the representative of the country which played a very important and huge role in defeating fascism in Europe, that defeating the fascism in Europe was a precondition, but not the end. Only precondition of creating peace in Europe, precondition. What was done by Europe to create peace in Europe was the European Union. The European Union, as a practical structure, political structure, is a really solution which gave us a big hope for peace in Europe. The same, the question about Ukraine and Russia, it's almost the same. I want to say that the conflict which we can see now started when European bureaucracy accepted shadow schemes of the gas supply. It was a strange story. Russia was supplying gas through Ukraine, but it was traded in Switzerland by some Ukrainian business people, which were sharing with this money with the Moscow highest bureaucracy, with this small company, which was literally in a small room, but they have a turnover about $8 billion supplying the gas from Russia to Europe. And European Union, bureaucracy of European Union were well aware about such kind of schemes, and they were accepting these schemes because it was the answer that the gas would be there, everything would be okay, and these strange Russians and Ukrainians, they are all mafias, but we would have a gas. With such attitude to what's going on in the east part of Europe, you would never, ever would create a stable Europe. Secondly, what I want to say, I want to send a message to the European politicians, and I want to say that Ukraine is not a buffer zone, and Ukraine is not a battlefield for the new Cold War. Ukraine is an Eastern European country, so the strategy must be created in their terms, like the strategy which was created about Poland, about Baltic republics, about all the others. But I want to take 3 minutes more to explain the substance of that. Let us look forward on 40 years from now. I want to make a statement. I think that in 40 years from now, there will be two major economic powers in the world. It would be North America and Asia. And the big question is what Europe is going to do in 40 years from now. Whether Europe would be a part of triangle, whether Europe would be prepared to be in competition with North America and Asia. And the answer is simple. Yes, if Europe would understand and would have a strategy that it's necessary to have the special strategy to integrate Ukraine and Russia, of course. Then when it would be an economy which would start from Lisbon to Vladivostok, that kind of economy can compete with South America and Asia. So what I want to say that when I'm speaking about the economic support of Ukraine, European integration of Ukraine, about creating a strategy on Russia with this exactly idea. This is not making a favor. This is a vital interest of Europe to solve this problem. And I want to remind, that was a last point. When concept of European integration was created, it was 2 years after the Second World War. When the half of Europe were under Stalin, when everybody was killing everybody 2 years ago, and the bold European philosophers and politicians created the idea of unification, realized it in 60 years, and now we have a peace in Europe. So it's a right time just now. Nevertheless, it's a big crisis there. Even because of this big crisis, to start creating a strategy for 40 years from now. That's what I want to tell you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank our panelists and maybe ask them a couple of questions before we could open the floor to the audience. And I would like to start with Oleksandra, because she started her presentation about the human rights and about Crimea in particular. And she mentioned that she didn't see any nationalism or any fascism in Ukraine, but unfortunately it is still seen in Russia. Would you like to comment on the use of the Russian language in Crimea and probably make a comparison with the use of the Ukrainian language and Crimean Tatar?
Ну, на самом деле это было сказано именно исходя из собственного опыта, поскольку уже, как замечали спикеры, что для России не существует в их, по крайней мере, медийном фоне ни украинцев, ни Украины как государства.
What I said was based on my own experience, because it has already been mentioned here that for Russia, Ukrainians or Ukraine as a state do not exist.
Поэтому уничтожение людей, которые говорят на украинском языке, считают Украину государством, является нормой, а не проявлением фашизма.
And thus, killing people who see Ukraine as a state is considered a norm and not as a fascist act.
В Украине, как и во многих других странах, есть проблемы, связанные с правыми группами и правой риторикой в некоторых политических партиях, но это не является ни политикой страны, ни проблемой, в которой ее сейчас представляет Россия в том объеме, в котором говорится.
Of course, there are right-oriented parties in Ukraine, but this is not the policy of the country, and it does not have the scope as is presented by Russian media.
Мы работали по предоставлению бесплатной правовой помощи в Крыму последние 3 года совместно с People in Need, чешской организацией. И за эти 3 года к нам не было ни одного обращения в приемную по нарушению прав русскоязычного населения.
Within the 3 years that we offered free help to people in cooperation with the Czech organization People in Need, we never received any claim on violation of rights of Russian-speaking population.
И это не то, что я могу придумывать, поскольку я заканчивала национальный университет, обучаясь на русском языке, и свободно говорит я, мои друзья, моя семья, и мы никогда не испытывали проблем с языком в Украине.
Me, my family and my friends have always spoken Russian, and we have never had problems with that on the territory of Ukraine.
И как раз с оккупацией Востока и Крыма стало небезопасно говорить на украинском языке.
And namely, with the occupation of Crimea and of the eastern part of Ukraine, it became unsafe to speak Ukrainian.
И то, что хотелось бы отметить, что у нас идет война, хоть ее так не называют. Война с соседним государством, которое более сильное, которое использует пропаганду. Война с тысячами жертв и больше, чем тысячами заложников.
And I would like to emphasize that there is a war in our country. This is the war with a neighbor state, which is very strong and uses very strong propaganda.
И эти люди виновны лишь в том, что они живут в Украине и хотят продолжать жить в этой стране.
And the victims can only be blamed for the fact that they want to live in Ukraine and they want to continue living in Ukraine.
Мы сейчас имеем больше, чем 1 миллион жителей Донбасса и Крыма, которые вынуждены покинуть свои дома и стать переселенцами на территории на остальной части Украины.
More than 1 million people had to move away to abandon the Donetsk region and the Crimea and to move to other parts of Ukraine. They were forced to do so.
И как раз политикой Российской Федерации является отрицание общих ценностей, отрицание прав человека, отрицание демократических прав и свобод, которые существенно сужаются с каждым годом в России. И это вызов не только Украине, это вызов всей Европе.
And of course, the Russian policy is oriented on negation of human rights, and this is a challenge not only for Ukraine, this is a challenge for the whole Europe.
Мы видим поддержку России крайне правых, крайне левых движений в Европе не меньше, чем в Украине. То есть раскачивание ситуации и ставить под сомнение саму основу европейского сообщества.
So Russia targets its actions at support of the right movements, not only in Ukraine but also in Europe, thus questioning the essence of the human rights issue.
И именно европейский выбор Украины послужил началу этого конфликта. То есть, если бы Украины получилось, то это стало основой изменениям в России. Именно этого они боятся.
And namely, the European orientation of Ukraine triggered this conflict because had Ukraine succeeded, Russia's fears would have been realized.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dvoretskaya. And I would like to address Minister Schwarzenberg. We've just heard Mr. Yavlinsky talking very argumentatively about the interest of the European Union in changes in the reforms that would happen in Ukraine and in Ukraine becoming a European state. And the opinion polls in the Czech Republic very much support what he says, and they say that most of the people, like 3/4 of the Czech population, support Ukraine. But there is a minor problem. They are more ambivalent about the sanctions, and the sanctions being the only mechanism so far being used to stop the Russian aggression in Ukraine. What does it take a politician to explain to the public that they need to put the money where the mouth is?
Well, I do think I will dare to contradict, first of all. I'm afraid that the interest of the European Union in Ukraine is very low. I mean, I was for several years Minister of Foreign Affairs. Probably Radek Sikorski and me were the only who, from time to time, and urgent, sometimes very urging, took the name of Ukraine in their mouth. But admittedly, before the whole war started, the interest was very low. People were happy, nothing to do there, no need to invest, no quarrel with Russia. The interest in Ukraine is low. Now it has awakened, which is true. But of course, as in Czech Republic, in whole Europe, there are two different views. One is what I already today said, similar to the view of Prime Minister Chamberlain, 1938, before the Munich capitulation. The view, Ukraine is a far-away country we know little about. Why should we invest money, political influence, eventual loss in our economic relations with Russia for defense of Ukraine? It's quite spread. And of course, people and companies who are interested in their business in Russia, as a rule, are more, let's say, understanding for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's one side. And one shouldn't underestimate the strength of the support of those ideas. There is the other, for the moment in the European Council, dominating, and in some capitals is dominating the view that we have to defend Ukraine. It is a European country, and as Yavlinsky once said, on the fate of Ukraine will be decided if in the 21st century Europe we have a hegemon that is a Russian Federation or not. The fate of Ukraine, the fate of Europe is decided. That must be clear to us. But of course, some don't like to look into the future. They prefer the present and good business with Russia. So the views are split. And of course, in the Czech Republic too, there are many sympathizers of Russia here. I don't doubt it, for good and bad reasons, but there are quite a lot of them. And on the other side, I'm convinced that the battle for Ukraine can only be won if the European nations and the United States consistent, if they carry on their points of view for several years, because this conflict won't be decided this week, this month, this year, probably not even in the next few years. It will be a very protected one, because for Moscow, Ukrainians are not seen as independent nations. Therefore, they see themselves entitled to own Ukraine because it's a part of the Russian nation, and maybe they will abstain for some reason for some time. But I don't think that Moscow will definitely stop any actions in Ukraine. Let's not forget what in Western Europe nobody mentioned, that the economic war against Ukraine started already 10 years ago. And what Moscow did to open and close the Russian frontiers for Ukraine projects, offering gas and oil for one price or the other with sometimes 100% difference. I mean, no normal economy could bear this way to treat them. So of course the Ukraine economy was disrupted by it. Let's admit it, and it's not in a good state. So there's some hope, of course, in Moscow that the Western Europeans will say, while the Ukraine look in what a disarray they are, why should we invest our good money in this faraway country? We anyway have no idea what the Ukraine politics is and what the Ukrainians really wish. So let's make a compromise with the Russians. And I would like to know now what compromise it would be.
Thank you, Mr. Schwarzenberg. And I would like to address my question to you, Mr. Baer. We have 2 Europeans here, and I hope I can call the Russians
you have 3,
Europeans, yes, arguing that it is a clearly European issue, and you said so too. But we also see that both of them say that Europe lacks the realization of this issue. And in many instances in the past, countries in Europe were much closer, not so far away countries, and with the people who we know very little about, as it was said in Britain before the Second World War. So the Americans had a better understanding and a better strategical understanding and a clear idea of what needs to be done, and they took the lead. Can the US take the lead now?
Well, I guess, I mean, I don't think, I think America's legacy of foreign policy in Europe over the last 120 years is one of which Americans are rightly proud, but I don't think Americans have a monopoly on strategic thought, and I think there are plenty of Europeans who do see very clearly, and I think, you know, your question to Minister Schwarzenberg about how do you make the case for, you know, the fact that people say that they want to support Ukraine but are ambivalent on sanctions, I think that's the right question. I mean, and you can talk about, I mean, to me you start from the question, can we do nothing? And if no, then you have to talk about what is it that you can do. You can use military force, which is a very high cost option and it imposes high costs on the other actor. Sanctions are another alternative way to impose costs on an actor. And you can talk about how to do them smartly so that they're targeted, et cetera. But it's a question, first and foremost, can we afford to do nothing? And I don't know that we have collectively made the case to publics, both in the United States and in Europe, about why doing nothing is such a bad idea. You know, it is incumbent upon us, and this is the conversation that I think America and Europe need to be having, both at in a public sphere as well as at an official level. And we've been working very closely with our European partners throughout this crisis. So, you know, not to say that this conversation isn't happening, but, you know, the rules of the international system don't just protect international security, they are the foundation for international commerce. A rules-based global order is so fundamental to our common strategy for the future because it is what gets us out of a zero-sum game in terms of our relationship to other states. It is what makes possible the alternative to zero-sum. We have to stay committed to a rules-based order. And if you are committed to a rules-based order, that means that when the rules are broken, you have to do something about it. You must reinforce them. You have to be committed to that. And I think that's where, as we coordinate how to respond to violations of the rules, that's the conversation that we need to be having both with our citizens and those and between policymakers in order to underscore that this isn't a chosen, this isn't a pick and choose for us either. We must respond because the future of the world that we have worked so hard and that frankly the European Union is arguably the triumph of, that's under threat when the rules of the rules-based order are so flagrantly violated.
Thank you. Mr. Yavlinsky, Europe and the United States can do whatever they want, but Ukraine is a hostage of the Kremlin and the imperial aspirations of many Russians who support this policy. And I want to address you a question from my son, he's 5 years old, and you know the 5 years olds are inexhaustible source of political wisdom. I noticed him, he was praying, and this is what the Ukrainian kids are doing nowadays. They draw pictures to the soldiers and send them to the soldiers in the front, and they're praying. And I asked him what he was praying for, and he said, well, for the family and for Ukraine and for the Russians. I said, what did you pray for? And he said, I prayed for the Russians to stop attacking Ukraine and to start protecting Ukraine. And I thought, well, this is a good idea. How can we help the Almighty to change the Russian public opinion?
First of all, congratulations. You have a wonderful son.
Thank you.
So tell him that his political wisdom is just excellent. Secondly, what I want to say that I hope that I know my people. And what we have just now, it's a big problem of the propaganda issue.
Yeah.
Believe me, if 95% of population is getting all information from television, and all television, all with no exception, is in the hand of the state, and they are lying from the early morning to the next early morning. They are not saying the word of truth at all. If you want to check me, try to see the reportage about this forum, about this session. Here they left, it seems to me, but here you have a state channel which was making just a television record. And you'll see that it will be completely different from what was told here. So
everybody heard you support the
yes.
Kyiv junta. So
this is very serious issue, and don't undermine it. I can give you the example. It's very often there is a speculations very often that Russians are such a people and so on and so forth. I don't believe in that. I want to reject that. And I want to remind you, when Nazi came to power in Germany, and Germans are one of the most developed and cultural nations of Europe, they became, let's put it very softly, very strange people in 2 years. And in 4 years, they were killing their own neighbors with whom they were living all their life. I mean, Jews, Gypsies, and the others. So that is the human nature. If you would make such a propaganda pressure in whatever country, more or less you would have almost the same response. This is our tragedy. Why that happens? I can explain why that happens. It happens because we, in the 90s, we didn't create private property. All property belongs to the state. That means that all money belongs to the state and controlled by the state. That means that you have no independent media. Then that means that you have no independent civil society in general. That means that you have no independent political parties as a strong forces in the country, and that is the problem. That means what I was saying to you, together with Professor Zubov, corporate state. That's the explanation. What is it all about? If tomorrow we would start the propaganda on the basis which your son is saying, that we should protect Ukraine, I don't know from whom, but this is another question. Yes, that we should protect Ukraine, that we are brothers and sisters, that Ukraine is the best country in the world. In 1 year, you'll have a different picture. And you can take the Russian polls. Before G7, let's say in St. Petersburg, which was 10 years or 8 years ago, look at the attitude of Russian people to United States. It was wonderful. Because half a year it was a positive information about United States almost every day in news. About the West, about Europe, about everything. Putin was saying we are a European country, there is no other way, this is the only way forward, we are Europe, and all this. Just opposite you have at the moment. This is my explanation. Of course you can speak about the culture, about history, about many things, but what's the shortest answer is, yes, we are just in a situation where the propaganda in the country is playing a crucial role. This is a fact, simply.
Thank you very much. And now I think we can open the floor to the audience. Unfortunately, we don't have very much time left, but I hope the questions will be, we'll have some questions. Yes, please. I would like to ask you to introduce yourself and to address a particular person in the panel.
My name is Vladimir Lame. I came from Albanian television, and I have a question for all panelists. Are you afraid that the same thing that happened in Crimea, it will be happening in Kosovo when we have a case of Serbia that doesn't recognize this state, and maybe in some days they will they will create invasion to the northern part of Kosovo, Mitrovica and so on, where is the majority of population Serbians?
Who would like to answer this question?
I can. So Serbia is going to be the chair of the OSCE next year, so I certainly hope not. I think more seriously, there's been some very commendable progress made by the Brussels through the Brussels negotiations between Serbia and Kosovo, and I think the expectation and all of our efforts should be on supporting the progress that has been made through those negotiations and seeing that progress continue. I certainly haven't heard the government in Belgrade indicate anything other than an intention to continue down that path of progress, and I think their intention to become part of the EU is something that they know is also linked to progress in those negotiations. So I think while we all need to stay focused on supporting Kosovo's development as a democratic state, there have been several recent successes in terms of elections at various levels. We need to continue to be ready to support that. I think we should stay focused on supporting that affirmative path rather than spending too much time on entertaining the hypotheticals.
Thank you. Next question, please. My question was for... who else would like? Yeah.
If I understood you correctly, then I want to just mention two things. They are a little bit unusual, but if you're asking, I'm ready to answer. First of all, I think that it was possible to avoid military operation in Yugoslavia in case of Kosovo. Instead of making Rambouillet show, it was necessary to come to Yeltsin and to convince Yeltsin to fire Milosevic. It was possible. But it was necessary to do at the very beginning, not when at the end, when the ground operation was almost inevitable. The only player who was able to stop the military action there was Yeltsin at that time, because he can pick up the phone and say, Milosevic, you are fired. Goodbye. That's what he did in May, but it was necessary to do in October, November. And that would give a chance to avoid a special military operation. But it was not the interest of those who was taking part in this operation. Yeah? This is the first point. And the second point, what I think that the solution for the Kosovo issue was, from my point of view, not so much creating independence as much as just integrating the whole Yugoslavia into European Union, as it was made with Slovak Republic and Czech Republic. Why this divorce was so peaceful and more or less normal and balanced and acceptable? Simply because both nations were well aware that they would be in European Union and the difference is not so big, and that can be done. I was watching that carefully. The same was necessary to do there. So I'm not sure that the strategies which were used at that case were right strategies.
Thank you. Question here. Could you bring the microphone? And if I can ask to ask just one panelist, because otherwise we won't have time.
I have a question to Mr. Yavlinsky, and of course I couldn't agree with him more what he said about the propaganda, even more that this propaganda is targeting also neighboring countries and sometimes the whole world. But my question is about his first presentation, where, again, I think that perhaps everybody in this audience will agree that it would be in all our interests that there was an area of peace and trade from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And you compared this process with the process of establishing of European Union, but European Union was established among democracies, democratic countries. It is not the case with Russia, and let's say even taking what was said by Mr. Khodorkovsky yesterday in the opening speech, it is a long way for Russia to become a democracy. So does it, where does it lead us? That means there is, whether you think that there is no chance to do something in between when Russia becomes democracy. And again, your idea was that only the peace among Russia and Ukraine is possible only when both will be part of Europe. So does it mean you think that there is no possibility, at least between those two dates when Russia becomes democracy and part of Europe, and that there is no possibility that there is a kind of a peaceful coexistence as it was, for example, during the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union?
Thank you. I would start answering from the second question. I hope that the ceasefire is really possible. I hope the peaceful coexistence, I hope, yes. I'm an optimist, so I hope. But I want to underline once again, strategically there is no solution different from what I told. Is it the solution for the long, would take a lot of time? Yes. But there is not an easy story. Simply not easy. And no promises. I don't want to make promises, and I would not recommend any country in the world, I mean European Union or United States, to give promises today to Ukraine. Stop giving promises which nobody can realize. If Russia would take the path to destabilize the Ukraine, it's very difficult to resist to that. Almost impossible. It's necessary to understand. So the solution is in the other. It's a very painful thing. Very painful, but that's the fact of life, simply. That's what I think it would be, and I want to be realistic with this. Your first question was about how long it would take. First of all, I want to say that in 1947, when the process of unification of Europe started, I would not believe that Germany was a completely democratic state. It was under occupation and divided, that is true. And by the way, it was a big Eastern Germany which was absolutely not democratic. And it was a big Eastern Bloc which was under Stalin, which was completely not democratic. Nevertheless, in 60 years, Europeans achieved the success and everything was settled. So what I'm saying, that it's necessary to start this process today, regardless that Russia is very far from democracy, even more far than before. It's much more far from democracy than it was. There were no democracy in the 90s, but now it is even less democracy than there. So it's very far. But so what? Especially because of that, it's necessary to start to create a strategy, to start working in this direction, and the success would come.
Thank you.
Charles Ross. I'd like to address my question to Mr. Yavlinsky and Mr. Baer for two parts of the same question, please. We have a tendency to look at the Ukrainian invasion by Russia as a momentary event in history, when in fact Russian military strategic policy from the last days of Yeltsin clearly defined in Russian exactly the tools and methodologies for doing this. We also have a tendency to exclude certain factors. For example, on the third day after the capture of Crimea was declared, President Putin signed the nationalization of all the oil and gas fields in Crimea and in the sea around Crimea. We have a tendency to forget that the obsolescence of the pipelines, the gas pipelines going through the Ukraine, requires major strategic investments. And the recent decision to sell gas from the eastern fields to China, in the absence of transnational pipelines across Russia, brings into question the decision of the Yanukovych administration to sign a contract for frackable gas and oil reserves that are known and well identified in eastern and southern Ukraine. There is, I would propose, a strategy behind the military strategy that we are discussing today, which is of long extent and dates certainly from the 1990s, if not before. I'd like to ask you, please, to address the question of the comfortable relationships of the status quo ante concerning the Ukrainian war and the comfortable relationships between competing and sometimes collegial oligarchical regimes, organizations in Ukraine and Russia, the issues of changing tariffs between Russia and Ukraine for certain types of international trade. These all are movable targets. I'd appreciate your thoughts on these. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not sure that I understood the question quite well. Still, I would try to give the answers on the elements of your question, which it seems to me that I understood. Yes, that is true, that in Yeltsin's policy there was a lot of elements of the same type, which we have just now in the Putin's policy on Ukraine. For example, that elements of the policy you can see in Georgia, in Abkhazia, in Tajikistan, in South Ossetia, so that it was not completely new. Simply possibilities of Russia were completely different. Secondly, I don't believe that there is a big deal what is about oil fields around Crimea. I don't know. I'm not an expert, but what I know for sure that the interest of Russia in many Ukrainian, South Ukrainian, and Eastern South Ukrainian and Eastern cities, which have a very strong military-industrial potential. It's 100%. This is absolutely that. And that was one of the reasons why he convinced a lot of people in the Russian bureaucracy, because it was clear that if Russia, of course, it was threatened by European Union, and it was not realistic because the protocol, which must be, which was supposed to be signed by Yanukovych, honestly speaking, is not very substantial. It was symbolic. It was about just first step. It was symbolic, but the people in Moscow were really threatened about that as a first step. So that's why it was such a strong reaction on all that.
To which you need to add the fundamental element in the Russian military policy of the rapid reaction helicopter forces. The motors of Russian helicopters come from the factory near Kyiv.
I'm really sorry, but this needs to be the last question. Thank you.
So that's the structure. And guidance systems for ICBM.
Sergei Lagodinsky from the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Berlin. You spoke of 1989 as the end of strategic thinking, but it was maybe the beginning of institutional thinking. We thought in institutions for the past 25 years, OSCE, NATO, EU, enlargement, etc., etc. Are we at the end of institutional thinking? During the panel, we spoke about the Sikh man Europe, EU, but we didn't actually talk about OSCE, even though we have an ambassador here as an actor. Is there at all a possibility of still thinking in institutions? And if yes, is there a possibility, even hypothetical, to involve Russia in any kind of institutional structure in the nearest future?
You are the
and I don't think that that Ambassador Baer is the right person to answer this question. I don't want to put him in an embarrassing position. So maybe you or Mr. Schwarzenberg, if he's still listening.
Okay, what can I say? When we are talking about the issues of that kind of size and dimension, like relations between Russia, Ukraine, and Russia and Europe, Russia and let's say the other world, as far as I understand, NATO and the other institutions, they are expressing the political agenda and political views of the countries which are the members of these institutions. So the beginning is starting from the national governments, and then it comes to institutions which are realizing these policies. If the national government is not able to come to agreement on the most important things, what can do the institutions? They can't. It's like European Union. Everybody is very happy, but nobody knows what to do.
Can I make 2 points on that? I agree with that. I mean,
you agree with that?
Richard Holbrooke used to say about the UN that blaming the UN for not being able to do something is like blaming Madison Square Garden for how the New York Knicks are playing basketball. It's the forum, not the players, and it's the players that matter. You know, I think I agree that you have to start with the national actors. That said, I think what's really worrying for me, given my parochial beat, is that aside from being an organization, obviously the OSCE was founded on a set of political commitments. And to crudely simplify, the grand bargain was, we care a lot about open societies, and you care a lot about borders, so we'll care about borders if you care about open societies. And now they don't care about borders. So what's the grand bargain? And I think, then that goes back to, you need to have a political, now you might be able to use the old institutions as the forum for that political discussion, but I think, for those who know the OSCE, in some sense we're actually, at least right now, back in a CSCE moment rather than an OSCE moment. The idea was, at the end of the Cold War, we had bridged enough of the political gaps to be able to move into an operational cooperative mode and to iron out the rest of the politics as we went. We've got huge political rifts again, and the question is whether or not we have the tools to within the platforms, the institutions, to address those. It can't be. Certainly that's why starting down the path, it can't, he said it's back to realpolitik. Starting back to the path of talking about buffer zones or buffer states, that's exactly wrong, right? If you have we've worked so hard to get away from force governing politics, force alone governing politics. We won't ever leave force completely out of it, but force alone governing politics. We've worked so hard to develop a system where rule of law plays a significant role in international politics. We can't start going back towards this all being a giant physics experiment where, you raise this side and then that side blows up. That's not an acceptable. We shouldn't cede that project. But we do need to go back to saying the only sustainable. The point was made that the sustainable strategy for Europe is the integration of Russia and Ukraine. The sustainable strategy for Russia is joining Europe. The flip side is also true in the long run. And so we have to go back, and there has to be democratic progress in Russia. I agree that there has to be democratic progress in Russia before that strategic possibility is possible.
Thank you very much. And I was asked to make 3 concluding points in this discussion, trying to summarize it. The first one is about Ukraine, that it's probably even further from its task to become more successful and prosperous European nation, but as a society, it is a more consolidated society now. That the realization of what Europe means for Ukraine, what Ukraine means for Europe, is better formulated in Washington than in some European capitals. And we're still working on the strategy, and the only person with the strategy so far is Mr. Vladimir Putin. And I would like to thank everyone for a brilliant and very stimulating discussion, both the panelists and the audience.